Welcome to the e-learning module entitled Risk Assessment. What is risk assessment and why it is so useful on board? Risk assessment applies to maritime industry, and we can manage these risks to have safer maritime industry. Risk assessment as a decision-making tool. Everything in life has some risk. What you have to actually learn to do is how to navigate it. This quote from Reid Hoffman outlines what risk assessment is all about. On board a ship, there are many hazards, and these pose even more risks. Risk assessment acts as a tool to manage these risks. There are three main reasons as to why it is important to carry out risk assessment. Number 1, because it financially beneficial as it helps to reduce the risk and thus accidents. Number 2, because it is regulatory requirement and thus legally required to conduct risk assessment. Paragraph 1.2.2.2 of the ISM Code states, safety management objectives of the company should assess all identified risks to its ships, personnel, and the environment and establish appropriate safeguards. This 2010 amendment to ISM Code has included the risk assessment explicitly. Number 3, because it is morally and ethically right thing to do, as risk assessment helps in preventing injuries and accidents. The use of risk management techniques started from the insurance industry. When the industry plans to insure a particular object, especially a new one, they need to conduct a risk assessment. This helped them to decide whether it is okay for the business to go ahead with it. The hazards and risks involved decides the amount of premium. Even with maritime scenario, the whole purpose of the risk assessment is to answer this question. Will it be safe to go ahead with an operation? It was the year 1997 that marked a major step towards risk-based approach in the maritime field. This was the time when the Maritime Safety Committee, MSC, and the Marine Environmental Protection Committee, MEPC, of the IMO adopted the interim guidelines for the application of formal safety assessment, FSA, to the IMO rule-making process. Since then, risk assessment has only been evolving, and it has now become a decision-making tool at the ground level too. Various publications provide various guidelines regarding the steps for risk assessments. The most widely accepted in shipping industry is the 5-step process. Number 1, identification of hazards. Number 2, risk estimation. Number 3, control the serious risks. Number 4, identify benefits, implement action and establish responsibility. Number 5, monitor the risks. First step is to identify all the hazards. But to identify hazards, we must understand what a hazard is. We sometimes get confused between hazard and risk. These examples can simplify this. A ladder is a hazard which creates a risk of falling. Grease on deck is a hazard, slipping is a risk. A hammer is hazard, injuring your thumb is risk. Lack of oxygen is a hazard, asphyxiation is a risk. Oily rags is a hazard which creates a risk of fire. Hazard term. The use of the term hazard originated in the nuclear and chemical industries, for which a wide range of different types of hazards are present all the time. Example given: nuclear material, flammable gases, toxic chemicals, etc. Hazard is a substance, situation, or practice that has the potential to cause harm. Risk is the probability of the harm occurring, combined with the consequence of the harm. The hazard may be a physical situation such as fishing vessel because it may collide with own vessel. It may be an activity like crane operations because the load might drop. It may even be materials such as oily rag because it might catch fire. In practice, the term hazard is often used for the combination of a physical situation with particular circumstances that might lead to harm. For example, a collision with fishing vessel, a dropped load, or an oily rag fire. Hazard identification. It is difficult to declare completeness of a hazard's identification process, and hence hazard identification should be periodically reviewed. Risk assessment in general and hazard identification in particular is a teamwork. Number 2. Risk estimation. Safety is related to the degree of absence of risk. Because no activity is free of risk, an activity is considered safe when the level of risk is within acceptable limits. But how do we know if the risk is acceptable or not? We should be able to calculate the risk, and we should know how much risk is acceptable. In short, we should know how to calculate or estimate risk. IMO defines risk as the combination of the frequency and the severity of the consequence. MSc Circular 1023/MEPC Circular 392. Here the frequency is the number of occurrences per unit time example given per year, and consequence is the outcome of an accident. Risk has two components. How likely is this to happen? Likelihood of occurrence, frequency. How bad would it be if this did happen? Severity of the consequences. We would need both the above components for estimating the risk. A reliable equipment would mean that there are lesser chances of it breaking down. That is frequency. Likelihood of occurrence is low. But to estimate the risk, we also need to consider the severity of consequences if the equipment fails. We need to combine both these factors to get a fair estimation of risk involved in using this equipment. Traveling by a plane has far more severe consequences than traveling by road. But the frequency and finally the risk as per statistics is far less. But it is a matter of fact that the perception of risk is higher than the actual risk in case of travel by a plane. This is perception of risk vs actual risk. Even though we think the risk for traveling by air is higher than traveling by road, but still we travel by air. This is the basis of risk assessment and is called as low as reasonably practicable, or a LARP. As low as reasonably practicable, or a LARP. If we go by road, there is some cost, time, and effort involved. These would be disproportionate to the benefits of risk reduction that we would achieve. Cost, time, effort involved. So in deciding the practicability of how much risk reduction is enough, we compare a hazard with three things. It is possible that we avoid traveling by air, but it is not practicable. Possibility versus practicability. The fundamental principle of risk management acknowledges that the risk cannot always be eliminated. But it is possible to reduce them to a level that is a LARP. This is the level where the risk is tolerable as reasonable practicable risk reduction measures would be in place. So we can estimate the risk by combining frequency and severity of consequences. This combination of frequency and severity of consequence can be done in many ways. Risk estimator matrix. Each company may have different method which you will get in company's safety management manuals. A company may decide to prepare a risk estimator matrix with likelihood and consequences on the Y and X axis respectively. The likelihood and consequences to be estimated with existing controls in place and a resultant risk calculated from the matrix. The company SMS should identify the level of risk for which additional controls will be required before the job is started. Another methodology is to give values to frequency and consequence and then calculate the risk by multiplying the two values in each example. Risk equals frequency multiplied by consequence. For example, the company might decide that additional controls are required if the risk level is moderate or above as per example of risk matrix. Remember, the likelihood and consequence is to be estimated with existing controls in place. The company SMS has to identify the risk value for which additional controls are required. Few company SMSs recognizes that the risk depends more on consequence than the frequency. In this case they calculate risk as below: risk equals frequency x consequence squared. What method we need to follow to calculate the risk would depend upon your company's SMS. Number 3. Control the serious risks. This is the step in which we evaluate options for controlling the estimated risks. The principle of controlling the risk is simple. We should aim to remove the risk. But even if we cannot remove it completely, we must reduce it to as low as reasonably practicable or a LARP. When you can move the risk, do it. When you can't, reduce it. There are 4 ways we can handle the identified risk. 1. Avoid the risk altogether. 2. Reduce the potential impact of the risk. 3. Transfer the risk to another party. 4. Retain the risk with no planning. Number 1. Avoid the risk altogether. Not a likely option if the work or operation has to be completed. But this may be necessary at times for safety. For example, in an emergency, if we have to abandon the ship in rough weather, we cannot avoid it though it would be risky. Number 2. Reduce the potential impact of the risk. This involves reducing either the likelihood, frequency, of a loss occurring or the consequence, severity, or both. This can be achieved by taking extra precautions. When we take extra precautions, it is important to evaluate what is decreasing: likelihood, consequence, or both. Number 2. Reduce the potential impact of the risk. Usually it is the likelihood that will decrease, as decreasing consequence at times is not practical. But there can be times when the consequence alone or both will reduce. An example can be working aloft on a mast. Using a safety harness will reduce the likelihood of falling down because if at all the person falls, the consequence will be same. The consequence can be reduced if we rig a net below the mast. Number 3. Transfer the risk to another party. Not a common option for seafarers but can involve the use of specialists or technicians. For example, a contractual transfer of risk to a third party by hiring a third party to do the work. Number 4. Identify benefits, implement action, and establish responsibility. Now that we have estimated and identified the steps to manage the risk, it is time to implement these actions. We also need to establish responsibilities for each identified actions to reduce risk. Number 5. Monitor the risks. During the course of work, many factors can change. It is important that we continually monitor, review, evaluate and modify the first 3 steps in the process. We also need to document a feedback at the end of job. The feedback should mention if the control measures taken for the job were enough. This feedback then can be used next time similar job is planned. Type of risk assessments. Formal. Formal risk assessment is done as a team. It starts with a meeting for hazard identification, completing all steps, and the process is usually logged down in a specific form. Informal. An informal risk assessment complements the formal process and is not a replacement for formal risk assessment. It is usually done on an individual basis for his daily work activities. Take 5. For example, take 5 and SLAM. Stop, look, assess, and manage. Techniques remind us to stop work if our health and safety is at risk. Qualitative, semi-quantitative and quantitative risk assessments, QRA. Qualitative risk assessment techniques uses simple methods to evaluate risk. This does not need a high level of skill and can be measured in non-numerical ways. An example is the risk matrix generally used on board ships. Quantitative risk assessment uses complex methods like special software which precisely calculates the numerical value of risk. This requires high skill levels and knowledge of software or other applications. The classification societies have developed software for the use of highly hazardous operations. Semi-quantitative risk assessment lies somewhere between the above extremes. It uses numerical values to calculate risk but does not use special techniques like a software or similar application. Semi-quantitative risk assessment. For example, if both the probability and severity can be quantified, the risk is simply the product. Risk equals probability multiplied by severity. On board ships we generally use qualitative techniques. Conclusion. Risk assessment is no more an additional voluntary safety tool. Shipping industry is becoming more and more serious to it. Following any incident, the first question that is asked is, if the risk assessment was carried out or not. The effectiveness of risk assessment in reducing the risks depend upon the seriousness with which it is carried out. This is the end of the e-learning module entitled, Risk Assessment. Thank you.